Well, good evening, brothers and sisters and friends, and welcome back. We have had a 2 week break from last we met together. So good to be back with you as we continue our study of the book of Judges. We're going to continue chapter 4 tonight, but since we've been away for 2 weeks, we'll do a little bit of review before we move on. We discussed last week the state that Israel found itself in before Jabin, a Canaanite king, took over. It was a terrible state, in fact, but what brought them to that state again, as it did in all the other accounts that we have read thus far, is they decided to not worship God, not obey Him, and instead they were worshiping idols. And so this Canaanite king was very harsh to the land. In fact, we see where we discussed how in Judges chapter 5 and verse 8, it says that not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. So he oppressed them technologically speaking, but he also oppressed them from a society or a social point of view. People were afraid to take the major highways because of all the bandits that could hurt them and take their goods, so they would go through mountain passes. It says that, all the activity that was once in these villages, in the rural areas, well, that ceased. And so we see oppression here. And there is great lamentation, if you will, concerning the oppression. And people want the Lord to do something about this kind of oppression. They would love to feel the freedom that they once did. And so as we see through the cyclical formula, if you will, of the book of Judges, they're calling out for a judge in heart, and the Lord answers the call with two judges. One who was already a judge, her name was Deborah, and the other one whose name was Barak. Now we will discuss these protagonists a little bit later in our discussion this evening, but let's talk about the antagonists. As we discussed, Jabin or Abin, king of Canaan, and he reigned in Hazor, but he's also known in some scholarly circles as well as the king of Hazor, even though he is right now king of all of the Canaanite city-states that he is in charge of in that specific region. But then he hires a general by the name of Sisera. Now, Sisera is not a native Canaanite, but a mercenary general hired by Jabin, king of Hazor, to lead the armies of the king. In fact, there are some scholars that believe that Sisera is actually Syrian and not Canaanite. We see where he set up his headquarters in the plains of Harosheth Hagoyim. And the reason why he set his headquarters there, if you will, is because he had 900 chariots under his command. And so he had to have a place to store all of those. This oppression that we were discussing lasted for 20 years. Can you imagine 20 years of not being able to take the major roads out of fear of bandits? Or can you imagine 20 years of the taxation, 20 years of really they're feeling like there is no hope? And that's exactly the state that we find Israel at this juncture in our study. But now let's talk about the protagonists. The protagonist in our text, one whose name is Deborah. In Judges chapter 5 and verse 7, this is how Deborah describes herself. She says with inspired hand, until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. Judges chapter 5 and verse 7. Now, why would Deborah describe herself as a mother to Israel? On account of her having watched over her people. Why would she call herself a mother? It was because when we look at how Deborah judged, she actually judged Israel with a maternal care and not a paternal care, but a maternal care. Now, how do we know this? Well, in Judges chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, let us go to our passages together. As it says, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. And she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim, and the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. We get a sense of who Deborah is, and we also understand that she was judging Israel from more of a maternal perspective than a paternal perspective. What is the first clue of this? Well, number one, the scriptures teach us that she was a wife. Secondly, just like a mother, she was available to those whom she was responsible for. Just like a mother, she would settle disputes between the ones who she was responsible for. And just like a mother, as we see in verse 6, she is going to seek out protection for those whom she is responsible for. And so as we can see how Deborah is judging the people at this juncture, we see where she was very maternal in the way that she led. These are motherly instincts. And so it is not surprising that in Judges chapter 5 and verse 7, she would describe herself as a mother in Israel. But I also want to talk about something regarding Deborah that is very interesting to discuss. And it is in this, that Deborah differed from all the other judges who appear in the book in four respects. Okay, number one, first, she was a woman. Women in positions of political or spiritual leadership during Old Testament history were very rare. In fact, the last woman that I can think of that had any kind of influence over the people was Moses' sister by the name of Miriam, when we read about her in the book of Numbers. But Deborah here, as we have already seen in the text, is called a judge. And I believe that to be very, very significant to the social aspect of what is going on here at this time in Israel's history. Secondly, unlike the other judges who began their careers in response to a foreign oppression, we see where Deborah seemed to have been active sometime prior to the prophecy that she was given about how she needed to raise Barak to lead an army and to beat Sisera and free the people from Jabin, king of Hazor, and his Canaanite oppression. We see here where thirdly, Deborah is described as a prophetess. Now, a prophetess was a very unique individual because just like a prophet who was a man, a prophetess, being a woman, was given direct revelation from the Lord. And this direct revelation enabled her to interpret the past, give direction in the present, and announce the future. And then the fourth characteristic that we see in this very interesting person of history by the name of Deborah is that she had a regular spot from which she judged Israel, as we have just read. In fact, when you go to verse 5, she would sit under the palm tree. Notice the name, the palm tree of Deborah. Now, Judges was written with inspired hand years after Deborah was judge. So it makes me wonder that if there was a tree in this spot and the folks of Israel just started calling that the tree of Deborah, because that is where she would hold court, if you will. And so this is where we see a regular spot, a centralized location from which she judged Israel. And it was between the towns of Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, as we read together. But now let us turn to verses 6 and 7, and let's discuss the second protagonist that we find in our text. In verses 6 and 7, it says, Then she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, Go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor? Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun, and against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. Deborah is a prophetess, and Deborah is being called by God to tell Barak to raise an army that would defeat Sisera and give the people of Israel the freedom that they so desperately desired. But I want to look at the way that Deborah approached Barak, because it's so important to how we see our Lord working through the book of the Judges. We have what's called an oracular element. This is just a fancy way of saying that Deborah was acting as an oracle of God. And being a prophetess, that's exactly as she was. The citation was found as, Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded? And so this is a question given to Barak, and it's really interesting because the text implies that Barak was told to do this by the Lord at some point, and what the question implies is that Deborah is reminding him of what the Lord originally told him. And I found that to be very interesting. The charge is given at the end of verse 6 going into verse 7. And the charge was to deploy troops at Mount Tabor, to take 10,000 men. The source of these 10,000 men would be the tribes of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. And then in verse 7, that against this army of 10,000, the Lord would deploy Sisera against Barak, but Barak would gain the victory. So we come to the third part of this oracle, and that is the committal. And God says, I will deliver him into your hand. But what I find so very interesting with this formulaic way of looking at this specific oracle is we will see the same thing when we cover Judges chapter 6, verses 11 through 16. We have, again, the formulaic way of looking at the oracular element. We have the citation. This one was given to Gideon by an angel of the Lord. The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor. We have the charge given to Gideon. Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel. But we also see the Lord promising here, don't we? We see a committal. In verse 16, it says, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man. And I found that to be very interesting regarding the oracular element of these, what some scholars call the war oracles. Now, what's very interesting is you can read oracles of other ancient civilizations. The one in particular that I'm thinking about is one that Herodotus talks about concerning an oracle with Persia. But that oracle didn't go according to plan. And the reason why is because that oracle did not come from God. But these oracles did come from God. And God promised Barak, as he promised Gideon, I am with you and I will deliver them into your hands. And so I want us to notice here how the orders were very clear. Barak was supposed to amount a force. We have discussed that already. He is going to lead this force against Sisera, who the Lord is going to bring Sisera his way. And he's going to lead him to the river Kishon. And that is where Barak and his army would strike. Now, the location in warfare is very, very important. Because if you are the one mounting the offensive, you want to make sure that the one whom you're facing against can't create for themselves a strong defensive position. And so meeting at the river and attacking from a flank that would drive the other army into a river was a good strategic military plan. In fact, the river Kishon in Judges chapter 4 and verse 7, according to Brother Kaufman in his commentary of Judges, he said in normal weather this river is merely a dried up wadi, but in the instance of a rain, it becomes a roaring river. Of course, Sisera knew that, and if it had been the rainy season, he would not have deployed his chariots in such a dangerous location. This indicates that it was certainly an unexpected and untimely rain that turned the battle into the advantage of the Israelites. It was through her gift of prophecy that Deborah knew this and set in motion the events that led to the great victory. And so one thing for us to understand here is that God is at work. Because not only has God promised, but notice how God delivers them into Barak's hand. And that is for this river Kishon to be overflowing in a time that the river normally wasn't overflowing. So this is good news, right? This is a promise of victory. Barak should have great confidence in this. But notice verse 8. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. So she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. And he went up with 10,000 men under his command, and Deborah went up with him. Let's look at the response of Barak here. It is so important to not disparage the character of Barak at this point. And I see a lot of commentators doing it at this juncture. They equate his answer to the prophecy by asking for Deborah to go with him as an act of cowardice. But let us not forget what Hebrews 11 verse 32 says of Barak. The writer says, what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell you of Gideon, notice this, and Barak, and Samson, and Jephthah. Barak is included in the hall of the heroes of faith. So I personally, now this is just my opinion, but I'm very careful to equate Barak's motives to cowardice. Barak recognized that Deborah was a prophetess. Barak also recognized that because she was a prophetess, she was not speaking on her own. She was surely a mouthpiece for God. I believe this is the reason why Barak asked for Deborah to join him on the field of battle. His faith was calling for help from on high to give him the strength to face this formidable foe of Sisera and his force of 900 iron chariots. But just as Gideon would ask for later, Barak needed proof that this was in fact going to happen. And this is where we see Barak running into a little bit of trouble, isn't it? He had to have the proof. His faith at that point in his life wasn't strong enough for him to put this problem in the hands of God and keep it there. So even though we cannot equate his actions to that of cowardice, they do show a weak faith. Now that we have discussed the two protagonists, Deborah and Barak, we're going to end there for tonight, because what we see Barak's problem is so many times can be our own problem. How many times have we been promised that the Lord will provide, for we do not have a care in the world? But yet, what do we do sometimes? According to Jesus in Matthew chapter 6, we worry. Even though we've been promised we won't go hungry, we won't go without clothes, we won't go without our daily necessities, yet sometimes what do we find ourselves doing? We find ourselves worrying. We sometimes ourselves ask for proof that God will provide, and He always does. And so let us make it a point this week, into the next week and the week after that, to not go about a prayer life with the weak faith of Barak, but with a faith like Deborah. God said this is going to happen, and that's exactly what's going to happen. What did Jesus say concerning our daily need? He said that our Father knows what we need before we even ask Him. And so let us do our part to have a faith like Deborah, to believe in the power of God Most High. And whenever we have worries and cares, brother and sister, let's put those worries and cares into the hands of God. Let us not ask for proofs. We find proofs all through the Scriptures, but the Scriptures also say we walk by faith and not by sight. Maybe there's someone that is watching our video tonight that you're ready to walk by faith. You're ready to put on Christ in baptism, and you want to learn more about how to do that. Well, please contact us. Our information card will be at the end of the video. We would love to visit with you and help you answer the questions that you may have. Maybe there's a brother or sister who's watching this video that you find yourself not having the faith like Deborah did, but a faith like Barak. And maybe you know you shouldn't ask for proof, but yet you find yourself doubting. Brother, sister, don't do that. You know, James says, for he who doubts is like one who is blown to and fro, tossed by the waves caused by wind. Don't allow that to be in your life. And if you need help, if we can pray with you or pray for you, please let us know if we can be of help to you. And until we meet again, I bid you all a very pleasant good evening.